Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens with mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And today we are talking to Michael Colborne, who is a journalist. He writes with a variety of publications, including Bellingcat, and he has a focus on transnational fascism. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Well, thanks for having me.
I guess, just to begin with, could you explain maybe the last 20 years of Ukrainian geopolitics concisely for us?
I'll try. I might have to do a PhD dissertation to explain where that comes from, to really explain where it comes from. But to try to present it reasonably concisely, I think where contemporary Ukrainian nationalism comes from. I mean, what we see today in the country, particularly from the Azov movement, who listeners might be or probably are aware of. That's a movement that has its roots in Ukrainian nationalism as far back as World War II, with collaborating forces of Stepan Bandera, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, Ukrainian Insurgent Army. I don't need to get into the history and the politics and the historical memory disputes over all of that. But essentially what happened, the story of Ukrainian nationalism after 1990, 1991 was something quite similar to what happened across a lot of other Central and Eastern European countries after the fall of communism. And particularly what you see in countries like Ukraine, former Soviet country, and also what you saw in other Eastern Bloc countries like Czechoslovakia, obviously now Czech Republic and Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, and also what you saw in the former Yugoslavia in a slightly different way, but as part of a similar trend, saw in countries like Croatia. What happened after 1991 is in some of these countries like Ukraine, Croatia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, places like that, nationalism or any expression of nationalist sentiment, however mild, was suppressed by the authorities. And long story short, obviously not just in Ukraine, but across the board, and I'm painting with a very broad brush here. But what ended up happening is, for a number of reasons, the only way that one could sort of express dissatisfaction with anything in the communist era was through some sort of essentially the only way, or the most obvious way, was through nationalism, where people, especially in places like Ukraine, Croatia, where they felt with considerable justification that their identities as ethnic groups, as groups of people, as nations, were being suppressed by communism. And what happened after the fall of communism in 1991, as these countries slowly gained their independence, these countries like Ukraine, their histories of being a nation are not, or as an independent nation, are not particularly long. There are not a lot of historical reference points for somebody in Ukraine or Croatia. Croatia is the other example I keep harking back on. Ukraine, before 1991, had only had two very brief flirtations with independence as an independent country, as an independent nation. And the most recent manifestation of that was during World War II, with the limited control that some Nazi collaborating forces had in Western Ukraine. So what happened, again, not just in Ukraine, what happened after 1991 is that in a quest to not just build a nation, but also build a national identity, a lot of these shall we say, more controversial figures from the World War II era past were partly brought back as heroes, or and in a sense, what was suppressed so much during the communist era, any expression of nationalism, it's almost as if things turned on its head, and nationalism, whether mild or extreme, became mainstream. And that's essentially been the case for various ups and downs for the last 3 decades of Ukrainian independence, and frankly, the independence of a lot of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, where these countries, like Ukraine, are still vexed by these questions of who they are as a nation, as a country. And when countries like that are still trying to work through those issues and a whole host of other issues, you get this situation where the the extreme far rights is able to step into the fold. And obviously what happened in Ukraine in 2014 was the war with Russian-led forces in the East. And for a number of reasons, that gave the far right another avenue to, even though they're still on the margins of society and in terms of public and popular support, it gave them an avenue for further legitimization. So those are the first 2 pages of the 400-page dissertation, I think.
I guess as the Azov movement is something that our listeners probably are familiar with, but maybe just from hearing, so-and-so went to Ukraine to fight with Azov. Could you explain what is the Azov movement? What's its relationship with the conflict?
The Azov movement is kind of a heterogeneous far-right social movement that has its immediate roots in 2014 in the war in eastern Ukraine. It essentially came about because when Russian-backed and Russian-led forces started essentially invading Donbass in eastern Ukraine, or fomenting a rebellion in eastern Ukraine in April 2014, Ukraine's armed forces were just in complete tatters at that point. It was I'm no military expert or military nerd, but it was in no position to be able to fight a conflict like that right away. It was just disorganized. It was underfunded. It was under-resourced. Everything that could be wrong with it was wrong with it. But what happened with the outbreak of war is that a lot of volunteers stepped in to fill the void. And that included, relatively regular citizens or other different powerful people, oligarchs and whatnot, funding small militias or battalions that ended up getting official sanction from the authorities. They weren't operating outside of the law. And Azov was one of those sort of small battalions that came out of those circumstances. So basically in May 2014, these sort of collection of far-right figures from a few different groups of people, largely from the city of Kharkiv, the second biggest city in eastern Ukraine, where there was a long-standing small far-right group or outright neo-Nazi group called Patriot of Ukraine. They provided a lot of potential fighters, and then they also allied with a lot of the football hooligans in the country and formed, at first, just a few dozen far-right guys and hangers-on who were getting training and wanting to go fight. They got a sanction from the state that included weapons, and very quickly in the conflict, April, May, June 2014, they swelled to a few hundred members, took part in some battles that they still hang their hat on in terms of successes. The extent to which their role was critical in these successes, I think, is still up for debate. But essentially, they grew out of that, got legitimized because essentially Ukraine, they needed somebody, they needed people to fight. And among the people that were willing to fight for Ukraine against these Russian-backed forces in the East were far-right guys and neo-Nazis. And despite those views, they got sanction. And from there on in 2014, they slowly grew a bit more, got more solidified. And by November 2014, they became officially part of the National Guard of Ukraine. So officially integrated into state structures. And then from that, over the next few years, it sort of grew and transmogrified into a larger social movement. By 2016, a political party, the National Corps, and then all sorts of other offshoot little groups and sub-movements and almost NGOs. And essentially it started from what was called the Azov Battalion at the time, now technically the Azov Regiment. It grew out of that into what we have in 2021, which is a very broad far-right social movement that really doesn't have any equals across Europe right now.
These are emergent forms of ultranationalism. If you examine groups like Azov, they're on the far or extreme right, but the conflict itself seems to have generated a whole series of other ideological conflicts involving notions of left and right and communism and anti-communism. And I understand that there are far-right groups and movements that are fighting, in a sense, on Russia's behalf within Ukraine. Can you talk a little bit more about how these emergent forms of nationalism, especially in the Ukraine, create different forms of conflict between left and right, and what those terms mean in this context?
The terms left and right in the context of Ukraine, period, let alone the context of Ukraine during a war, they're not always, for those of us from places like Australia or Canada, they're not always as easy to pin down in this context. But what's happened in the first few years of the conflict, it's certainly something that has faded off in the last few years, is the presence of foreign fighters on both sides of the conflict. And what you clearly have seen are far-right neo-Nazi figures taking part on both sides of the conflict. And the reasons for that are pretty complex and sometimes quite contradictory. So you quite literally, I'm sure, had these situations during the height of conflict where there were neo-Nazis from different countries who shared the same far-right views or worse, who were on opposite sides of the battlefield just because they somehow decided that fighting for what they decided, fight for the Ukrainian side against, Russian aggression, et cetera, sometimes painting that in terms of a really superficial and sort of nonsensical anti-communism. You had that on that side. And then on the pro-Russian side, the quote-unquote separatist side, you also had far-right neo-Nazi figures take part in that as well, like especially from countries like France. And you had people from places like Serbia as well who went to fight on that side. But getting back to this sort of the way that anti-communism or anti-leftism, period, that's something that has been, I think, instrumentalized particularly by the Ukrainian far right. What you've seen from the get-go with this conflict, and I mean, I see it currently. I mean, I'm one of these people who, fortunately or unfortunately, has a job of pretty much reading everything the Ukrainian far right puts out there, every message that it says on its public channels, and the way that the aggression, because it was undoubtedly aggression on the part of Russia and Russian-led, Russian-backed forces that essentially started the conflict. It may have been in reaction to events on Maidan, but it was the conflict never would have happened without Russia sticking its nose into it. But the way that Russian aggression or intervention has been talked about by the far right, it's framed as if it's just a continuation of the old Soviet legacy, and thus that Putin's regime, as ridiculously hyper-capitalist as it is, they paint it as I see this phrase in a lot of this kind of literature, as they call it like a neo-Bolshevik regime from the East. And you get this kind of Orientalism in the mix too. And I think it doesn't take a lot of familiarity with contemporary Russia or Putin or the Kremlin to realize that it's not exactly a bastion of communism, let alone anything that should lean to the left. So, and you didn't see it much on the Ukrainian side, but there were instances of, I think, foreign leftists or people who call themselves leftists going to fight for these pro-Russian statelets, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republics, and somehow buying into this idea that these unrecognized pro-Russian separatist statelets were actually some sort of socialist states. And I mean, come on, they're not. Yeah, so essentially, what I'd say is the idea of the left or anything left-wing in Ukraine, even before the war, there was really not much of a coherent, organized left in the way that you might see in other countries, or even in other countries in Central Eastern Europe. Part of that is down to the nature of Ukraine's political system because of the influence of oligarchs. I mean, parties are hardly ideological at all in Ukraine. They more just act in certain various vested interests. But before 2014, and then especially after 2014 and 2015, public discourse in Ukraine is generally right-wing and patriotic. It's not, I'm not going to say that it's nationalistic or far right across the board, but public discourse generally does lean to the right, and ideas that might be seen as too left are thus seen as pro-Russian. So within that context, there's a lot of painting within Ukraine of anything that's perceived as left-wing, painting it as left-wing equals Kremlin equals pro-Russian. And it's a very strange thing to have to wrap your mind around. Like when the far right criticizes things that I do or say and paints me as being in league with the Kremlin because of that. It's just like, well, what are you talking about?
That famous Bellingcat Russian love affair.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, I mean, come on. Look who I write these things for.
You're listening to 3CR 8:55 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital on your DAB radio. We are currently talking to Michael Colborne about the Ukrainian far right. And I think it's probably fair to say that this is the sort of conversation you will not find anywhere else on the Australian airwaves. So do please consider supporting allowing us to continue having these conversations by subscribing to 3CR. Check out 3cr.org.au/subscribe for more information. I'm glad to hear you say that it's confusing and contradictory, because I always find it incredibly confusing.
I think, yeah, it is. And it's confusing, and some of it is incredibly contradictory. And if somebody has in their mind a sense of how they think things play out, and then all of a sudden you find out, oh, then what, this person is saying that now, what's going on? But yeah, don't worry. It's complex and contradictory at the best of times.
Well, just on that point, we saw with Iron March, the neo-Nazi forum had these weird Russian connections.
Yeah.
The guy that was running the base was in Russia.
Yeah.
And yet Iron March was full of people talking about going to fight for Azov.
Yeah.
We also saw last year you wrote that Azov were like promoting pro-Putin authors. Like, what's all that about?
I think especially with Iron March, it's really quite, with looking at things like Iron March, or generally with the international far right. One thing I've learned, at least I think I've learned, with covering them and researching them and getting to some extent understand them, is that these categorizations of pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin, or pro-Russian or not pro-Russian, this sort of black and white thinking doesn't always apply to these guys. So that's why you would have a site like Iron March, which was, run by somebody in Russia and clearly had these Russian connections. But at the same time, if you look back, and I think I've touched on, and then some articles I think I wrote more than a year ago, you look through those stuff on Iron March, there's a lot of talk about Azov being the greatest thing since sliced bread, people wanting to go and fight for the pro-Ukrainian side, and somebody from Azov actually chatting with people and at least talking about getting people to go fight. This is like in 2015 or 2016. So it's old news now, but this is all going on a website that is being run by somebody based in Russia. And you mentioned the example of the article that I wrote, might have been just over a year ago. Yeah. What I found interesting is these guys that are part of the Azov movement, kind of particularly on sort of an extreme faux intellectual wing of it. They kind of developed this obsession with Franco Freda, who was an Italian neo-fascist terrorist from the years of lead, the 1970s in Italy. And they sort of developed a strange fascination with the Italian years of lead, and they translated a few works by Franco Freda, and that's what that article was about. And the reason why I framed the article the way that I did is because I'd already heard of Freda, but then I did a bit more research, and then I was just struck by the fact that these Azov guys were promoting somebody who's completely pro-Putin. And so that sort of thing is not a contradiction for them. In the way that they justified it after the fact, and they were not impressed with my article or me or the fact that I framed Franco Freda like that. They don't see any contradiction between like if somebody on the global far right has produced something or has some theory or some work that they think is interesting for them, they don't care at all if that person is like now pro-Russian or pro-Putin. They don't give a shit. And I think that's another example of the contradictions that you see. I mean, yeah, we can say that the far right, especially far right extremism anywhere, is beset by all these contradictions and by extremists themselves doing and acting in ways that just are like just on their face so ridiculously contradictory. And there's actually quite a good example recently from Ukraine of this kind of like comical contradiction. It was about 2 weeks ago now. Time keeps running away with me. So I think it was 2 weeks ago by now. I don't know. I can't remember. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, he did something that had been, some nationalists, patriotic people on the far right had wanted him to do, and even his predecessor that wanted him to do for a while. And he effectively, he did outright ban 3 television channels that were linked to the pro-Russian opposition party, and that were linked to Viktor Medvedchuk, who is a leading pro-Russian oligarch in Ukraine and somebody who's very close to Vladimir Putin. And so once these channels were banned, the uniform opinion upon sort of the mainstream civil society in Ukraine and the far right actually was that, banning these channels is great. You saw in the Azov movement's Telegram channels and public communications just praising this decision and shutting down these channels was such a brave, important thing to do. And this, just talking about how Viktor Medvedchuk and these channels are Russian propaganda tools. And if you look back, you don't have to look back very far. These Azov guys have been on all these channels. And I sent some photos to people because I just find it absurd that there's a period of time, about a year ago actually, where for a period of a few months, these leading Azov figures would go on these channels. And one of these leading figures, I don't remember what his exact position is off the top of my head. Maxim Jordan is his name. And he posted something and it had his face in the picture. It was like some sort of promo picture. He's pretty recognizable because he has this kind of long beard and just, you can pick him out of a crowd. And he was this sort of promo picture of him, looking all tough with these signs, crossed out signs of these 3 pro-Russian television channels. And then I just had to search on the Telegram channel from about 10 months ago. And he's appeared not just he himself, this one guy, has been on all 3 of these channels as a guest, and so have his colleagues. And they don't hide any of these contradictions. And it makes it really complicated to try to understand, like, okay, what do these guys actually really stand for? These guys that are painting themselves, it's not as simple as, these guys who are painting themselves as anti-Kremlin are actually pro-Kremlin because they're going on these channels or anything like that. I think it's just these guys don't care. And they embrace the ridiculous nature of the contradictions as that's just part of who they are. And within Ukraine, they do get called out on it some, but very quietly. It's more people abroad like me who make fun of it and call them out for it.
Speaking of the influence of foreign texts, it's also been the case that as far as Australia is concerned, along with sending, several fighters, a manifesto produced by the Christchurch killer has been translated into Ukraine and distributed there. Can you speak a little bit about that?
I certainly can, yes. In July or August 2019, when I was doing a lot of work then specifically for Bellingcat, looking into the Ukrainian far right, I just happened to see on a Telegram channel, because by this point, by a few months after the Christchurch attacks, I was able to, recognize what the ridiculous cover of that manifesto looked like. And there was a post in a very extreme neo-Nazi channel in Ukrainian that I followed that posted what looked like a bound copy of the Christchurch shooters manifesto in Ukrainian, and then it didn't take long to figure out from just looking at the literal post itself that this guy had either himself, well, a group of people, somebody had taken the Christchurch Shooters Manifesto and translated it into Ukrainian and was selling that for, I think, the equivalent of about $3, both within Ukraine and beyond. And people who had bought the manifesto would send photos back of themselves posing with it in various places, or with various flags or paraphernalia with it, like actual literal Nazi flags and daggers with swastikas in them, that sort of nonsense. And at the same time, another group, Wotanjugend, who is a sort of a Russia-based neo-Nazi network or website, I guess we'll call them, but they're based in Ukraine now. They, on their website, published, now I don't know if they translated it themselves or not, but they pasted up on their website a Russian language translation of the Christchurch Shooters Manifesto. So I wrote an article in August 2019 pointing out that, hey, there are other translations of this manifesto going around, but here's two examples of it. One in Russian being put up on a popular Russian language neo-Nazi website, and another not just translated into a language, but bound as like a real book and sold. And that just horrified me, and that compelled me to write about it. And very quickly after, I know the Prime Minister of New Zealand was rightly not particularly pleased about this going on. Ukrainian authorities said they were looking into it. Right after we published that article, we started getting death threats and things like that. We got a few more as 2019 wore on. But eventually in 2020, Ukrainian authorities reportedly arrested the individuals behind the manifesto, but the Telegram channel that promoted it is still operating. Those manifestos, as far as I know, were being sold and distributed into last year. And they also started after the success, quote unquote, at least as they frame it. So whether we take them at their word or not, they decided to translate it into Russian, or use a Russian translation, whatever, and also sell bound copies of that. So, I mean, the idea that there are individuals taking a ridiculous manifesto that was just nothing more than a call to murder and selling that as like a real book is still just, yeah, I don't have the words to describe it. And I'm glad that, it seems that the sale of that manifesto has either stopped or very much, deteriorated.
Well, Michael, we'll have to leave it there for the radio, but we will have a few more questions with you on the podcast version of this show, which people can find at 3cr.org.au/napassaran, and people can find you on Twitter at Colborne Michael. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
Well, that was a very interesting chat, Andy.
It was, Cam, as ever.
And you know what else is interesting?
No, please tell me, Cam.
Subscribing to 3CR. Andy, why should people do that?
Well, I think if people are interested in maintaining this sort of content on the airwaves, along with the many fantastic shows that 3CR puts to air, unfortunately it all costs money. So if you have a spare few dollars, I'd urge listeners to support the station, support our work and the amazing work done by so many others.
Well, that's all we've got time for. Global Intifada is up next. We'll catch you next week.
See you then. Recently, there was a debate in the UN about a motion that was put about commemorating genocide and the crimes of the past within Europe. And that motion was, I think, supported by Russia and opposed by others, as well as, I guess, if you look at the laws that have been introduced into Poland regarding historical accounts of the Holocaust and Polish collaboration and so on. What's at stake in these sorts of debates about historical memory, and how do you think this plays into the current conflicts we're witnessing in Ukraine and Russia and Eastern Europe generally?
Well, I think the first thing is that historical memory or interpretations of historical memory are still they're being instrumentalized as a weapon, like that resolution that you just mentioned. That's something that I know Russia has pushed at the UN before. And despite it sounding, despite it being agreeable, I think, to all of us, the reason for even doing that sort of resolution in the first place is they put that resolution forward knowing or hoping that Western countries, including the US and Ukraine, will vote against it, and therefore they can say, hey, these guys are in league with Nazis. I don't attach any seriousness to that UN resolution. I think there's a lot to criticize Western countries and my own country, our countries, on what they do about the far right and far right extremism. I don't think that that resolution is just something for news cycle fodder for Russia. But in general, historical memory is still a huge issue, obviously not just across Eastern Europe, but it remains an issue for all of us. I mean, both like there in Australia and here in Canada, we are both still wrestling, not always successfully, with our histories of treatment of indigenous populations. But in Eastern Europe, the issue kind of relates back to, I think, what I was speaking a bit about earlier, which is that for a lot of these countries in Eastern Europe that essentially became independent substantially, or in actual fact, for the first time in the 1990s, they had to embark on a process of not just building a state, but building a nation, building a national identity. And when you're a country in that situation, what a lot of these countries have done is drawn inspiration from episodes from the past of attempts at national liberation. And now this is where we come into big problems, because in, for example, the Ukrainian context, the Ukrainian national liberation efforts in the late 1930s, early 1940s they collaborated with the Nazis, despite what people still say today. I'm sorry, guys, they did collaborate with the Nazis, even though they also fought against them at times. And some of these figures also participated in the Holocaust as well. And you had this in Croatia as well, where after the fall of Yugoslavia, the rise of Croatian nationalism, or trying to build a Croatian national identity, so much of that was focused on figures from the Ustasha regime, which perpetrated some absolutely ridiculous atrocities against Jews and Roma and Serbs in the former Yugoslavia. So the contradiction is that in these countries, the pantheon of national heroes is unfortunately filled with people who may certainly have been people who cared deeply about their country or deeply about their nation or their language and wanting to be independent. But they were also people who willingly took part in and perpetrated some massive, massive crimes. And those legacies still very much have not been resolved. They certainly haven't been resolved in Ukraine. For example, looking at the figure of Stepan Bandera, who was a leading Ukrainian nationalist, even though he was imprisoned by the Nazis for a period of the war, he was first and foremost a collaborator with the Nazis to fight against the Soviets. And some of his forces, even though he didn't personally take part, some of his forces, people under his command, took part in the Holocaust and the murder of Jews and Poles. And yet Bandera is, for some Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainians, maybe not a majority, but a lot of Ukrainians, is still a national hero. And it's the same sort of thing in other countries as well, where how do you reconcile naming somebody like that a national hero with all the crimes that they or people under their command or people associated with them perpetrated in the past? Now, one strategy is the absolute denialism, and that's what you get in Ukraine with this sort of historical memory looking back to World War II, just flat out saying that Ukrainian nationalist forces didn't take part in the Holocaust or in mass slaughter, or they just flat out say, oh, they didn't collaborate with the Nazis. So you have this gulf between Western historians who have poured through the historical archives, especially after the fall of communism, and the evidence is pretty clear and pretty damning that there was a pretty broad collaboration with the Nazis. yet they still try to deny that some of those things took place. And that's the same sort of story across a lot of other Eastern European countries, where you see that, like Lithuania as well, where the pantheon of national heroes, the people who are treated as national heroes now as symbols or people who should be an inspiration to a nation as it continues to forge a national identity for itself. The things that they did in the past are just ignored or denied, or in the cases of the extreme right, they're acknowledged and thought of as good things. And then the converse on the other side is, especially in the Ukrainian context, is you have the Kremlin, and you definitely have seen this since 2014 in Ukraine. But the Kremlin spent, back in Soviet times, spent decades demonizing any manifestation, however mild, of Ukrainian nationalism as equivalent to Stepan Bandera, and that included like trying to write or publish things in Ukrainian at certain points. And even after the fall of communism and right into 2014, there still is this sense among people, of that sort of Soviet era ilk that any manifestation of even the slightest tinge of Ukrainian identity, even say wanting to speak the Ukrainian language or anything like that, equating anything like that with the worst excesses of far-right nationalism. So the problem is you get Russia now, and especially since 2014, instrumentalizing anti-fascism for its own ends. And then the converse is you get Ukrainians who will say that any criticism of the issue of the far right in the country is tantamount to repeating Kremlin propaganda. So you get in this sort of black and white either or style thinking. And then that's where people like me get stuck in some very broad middle where we will gladly point out, and I'm far from the only journalist or researcher who does this, point out the real issues and dangers with the situation with the far right in Ukraine without falling into these ridiculous propaganda tropes. But it's a middle that is not always the best spot to be in, but unfortunately it's the right spot to be in.
How does a figure like Nestor Makhno figure in the contemporary Ukrainian imagination?
Very, very little. Frankly, like a name like Nestor Makhno is not a name I hear a lot. Frankly, I haven't read or heard much about his anything to do with him in a while. It's that sort of history of Ukraine with Nestor Makhno never really comes up.
Because I guess when you think about, or when you mention a middle ground or a third way or something like that, Makhno was a figure who, an anarchist who fought Reds and Whites in Ukraine in the name of some kind of free society. But
that doesn't fit in. I think the contemporary far right in Ukraine would just see Makhno as part of this broad, quote unquote, neo-Bolshevik left, which includes everyone. So
we've spoken a bit about people going to Ukraine to fight for Azov, but we've also seen people from Azov traveling overseas to get involved in things. I seem to recall a couple of years ago in Hong Kong, a bunch of Azov guys showed up to sort of mass confusion.
Yeah.
What's that about? And is this sort of conflict tourism common?
What you just mentioned, that's especially now with COVID, in the past just under a year now, that really isn't common. And the situation you mentioned, I think it might have happened more than a year ago. Yeah. Those far right fellows who went to be revolutionary tourists in Hong Kong. Now the situation with them is interesting because even at that time, those guys had kind of moved away from Azov and were kind of doing their own thing. I think they were still clearly on the far right, but they were more just interested in being protest/revolutionary tourists and kind of getting into doing doing their own sort of videography and graffiti type things. So by the time those guys had made that visit to Hong Kong, I have to look up the exact dates. I don't even remember when it was. But by that time, they had already kind of moved away from Azov. And since then, they had moved even further away from Azov to the point where they had open conflict with the leadership of the Azov movement and even physical confrontation, as I recall, back last May. And since then, these guys I'm talking about who went to Hong Kong, they've gone really quiet to the point where I don't know I think they're just laying completely low and doing their own things with private security or whatever else they've decided to do now. But that's sort of thing of revolutionary tourism from Ukraine out, or at least international networking right now. One, because of COVID, and two, because of the international attention and criticism that it got from figures like myself and others. They really lessened a lot of that over the last year. Like, whereas in 2018, 2019, their international secretary would go to different events and things across Europe. Now they don't do any of that, or at least they don't do any of that publicly. I think their focus, Azov's focus, especially since late 2019 and now and then into 2020, and especially with COVID, their focus, at least for now, is much more internally within Ukraine. I think they've recognized that it's too difficult and there's too much of a risk right now with trying to, form these connections or export their model. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think the leadership, or at least a lot of the leadership, is that interested in doing that sort of thing. So if there's any potential blessing to COVID, it might seem like a blessing right now, is that it's curtailed some of these in-person far-right networking opportunities. But I think we all know that's not going to last, and they've still been doing all this stuff online anyways.
Speaking of revolutionary tourism and propaganda, it does seem to be the case that many of those sorts of actions or antics are performed for the camera to create content which can then be distributed on social media as propaganda. Azov has had some presence on Facebook and other channels. What's been the nature of its social media productions? And I guess with increasing criticism of sites like Facebook and so on, there's been various sorts of crackdown. But how does Azov negotiate social media since its emergence and I guess in the contemporary period?
Well, right now, especially over the past few months and back into last year, they've had some considerable issues because they have been effectively banned, outright banned from Facebook and Instagram. So there are no official organizational accounts on Facebook. There are sometimes new ones that pop up that sort of have fake names but are very easily linkable to Azov, and some of those disappear, and even ones that have stuck around, they have limited followers and exposure. So the way that they might have used Facebook or Instagram before has been completely curtailed as a tool for them. So like on Instagram, their private, individual members or individual people associated with the movement might still have their pages, whether they're public or private. And then some of those get shut down. But the prominent figures, prominent communicators, any sort of quote unquote official accounts with particular bodies in the movement, like, for example, a national core political party, those things really don't exist on Facebook or Instagram anymore for them. That tool has been taken away from them. So they increasingly now have to rely on Telegram, which is the story of a lot of far-right extremists across the globe right now. But in Ukraine in general, especially not just in Ukraine, but in Russia and other countries, Telegram is already much more commonly used than it is in a lot of other countries. Like, Telegram is used, even though it's still a very small percentage of the population that uses Telegram, it's still much more used by mainstream politicians and mainstream figures than it would be in the West, for example. So Azov's main social media communication tool right now is still is Telegram. And they they do use Twitter as well. There are official accounts that I follow, that anyone can follow, that do post things, but they get almost no engagement or no exposure, because I think the people they're reaching out to are even within Ukraine, because all this stuff is exclusively in Ukrainian, or in some cases Russian. It's mostly in Ukrainian. They're not reaching out to any international audience. So they're in a bit of a bind with social media right now, especially in the Ukrainian context, because I think, as anybody who's familiar with the Ukrainian social media space knows, Facebook is king in Ukraine in terms of having influence or reaching out or reaching people. And Azov can't use it right now. So any attempts to reach a broader group of people, they're really having some trouble with that. They still have things on YouTube, which do get several thousand views for some of their videos. There was some recent video. I can't figure out where they promoted it, but they had to have promoted it somewhere, because within 48 hours, it got like 45,000 views. So they're still going to what they'll try to do is figure out every exception, every nook and cranny to try to get their message out there with some of these platforms, because I think, like all people on the far right, they understand the power of these platforms and of any new platforms that come along, and they're going to try to use them.
Just finally, maybe this is taking a bit of a diversion from Azov. Someone else you've reported on recently is Robert Rundo and the Rise Above movement. Could you tell us a bit about that? I think there's some illustrative comparisons to be made of, like hungry MMA guys to things happening elsewhere.
Right. Well, Robert Rundo is quite an interesting character to report on in terms of the global far right. And for listeners who might not know, a quick background is that Rundo is American, was one of the founders of the Rise Above movement, several of whose members are in prison on various assault and rioting charges for actions at events across the U.S. in 2017, including at Charlottesville. Rundo himself and a few other of his comrades were charged under some federal anti-riot legislation with their own violence at rallies, I believe, in California. And their case got thrown out in 2019, but the U.S. attorneys are appealing it, and the hearing for that was in November, and so right now Rundo and his comrades are waiting for the outcome of that appeal. If the appeal is successful, then presumably at some point Rundo would face a new trial in the U.S. If the appeal is rejected, then he remains a free man. And so what Rundo did about a year ago, if not more, was he left the United States and went to Eastern Europe. He'd had connections in Ukraine with figures related to the Azov movement, those guys again, but those connections kind of seemed to have faded off, because he found himself in last February in 2020, he was at a neo-Nazi event in Budapest in Hungary. And then 2 weeks later, he was at another far-right event in Sofia in Bulgaria. And ironically enough, I myself was at both of those events, covering those events. And in one of those cases, I didn't actually see him and had to have him pointed out to me, which was embarrassing enough. But after that, he ended up going to Serbia. And this was not really a secret. I mean, because he posted stuff from being at this event in Hungary and being at this event in Bulgaria, and then filming a YouTube video from what was clearly recognizable as central Belgrade. And from there, when he would post something, it kind of seemed like, well, it was clear that he was still camped out or holed up in Eastern Europe somewhere. And as it became clearer and clearer into like August, September last year, that he was in Serbia. And in October, last October, so just a few months ago, I was writing an article about mixed martial arts, combat sports in the far right. And on his Telegram channel a few months before, Rundo had said that several Rise Above movement, or some Americans, presumably friends of his, were going to take part in a far right mixed martial arts event in Germany in October. That event it basically, that event never went ahead as planned, is the best way to summarize it right now. And I contacted Rundo for comment and got some interesting responses from him, shall we say. And so I decided to just kind of see what he's up to. And the reason why I really decided to look into him is because I realized he was in Serbia and I happened to be in Serbia at the time as well. So I started looking into what he was doing in Serbia, trying to figure out conclusively that he was there. And as I wrote about in a Bellingcat article, ended up publishing in November last year, it was very clear, conclusively clear that he was in Serbia and trying to build some sort of base there. So I published an article. It was drawing on some things from his past, but some pretty basic open source research from his Telegram channel, looking at photos, geolocating photos, other hints and clues that kind of were dropped on social media to basically pretty easily draw a conclusion. Okay, this guy is in Belgrade, least of all because he founded a company in Serbia, and that with his name. So it was very easy to find that piece of evidence. So I wrote that article, and that article, I mean, I didn't think it was particularly revelatory or groundbreaking, but there's some new things in it, and pointing out that this American far-right extremist was trying to make a new home for himself in Serbia. But that article really got a lot of coverage within Serbia. A lot of outlets picked up on it. I was interviewed like a day or two after it was published. I was interviewed by a few TV stations. It got written up by a few different outlets. And then because of the article that I wrote, or at least largely because of the article that I wrote, he started getting a lot more attention in Serbia, including from anti-fascist activists within Serbia. And so that carried on into December. And then in December, he was posting other pictures that were making it even more obvious he was still in Serbia. And I think it was maybe at the end of December, January of this year, some article on some fringe far-right Serbian website that had kind of connections to him, it published some hilarious article that claimed that I was using NATO money to fund Belgrade's anti-fascists. Now, I think it should be pretty clear that's false. I don't have that kind of money. I don't have NATO money, and I would. You're working for
Putin, right? So
yeah, like how does for one second I'm working for the Kremlin, then I'm working for NATO, and then sometimes I'm working for Mossad. Sometimes I'm working because I write for Al Jazeera. Sometimes I'm working for God. I must be some sort of really duplicitous character to keep all these different. But anyways, so this ridiculous article came out, and you can see that Rundo, because of the media coverage he got in 2017 from American journalists, he absolutely loathes media and journalists. He thinks we're all in league with law enforcement, which is kind of hilarious. So anyways, over the last few weeks, I'd see a few other things come up from this guy, knowing that he was still in Serbia and trying to build a bit of a network in Serbia with this sort of fringe part of the Serbian far right. He was clearly at least giving them some skills or insights into how to do propaganda, graffiti, far right fashion. He restarted up a far right fashion brand. Then he was working closely with some other far right fashion brand in Serbia. And then a few days ago, because I'm still in Canada right now, I woke up to news. It still hasn't been confirmed, but a report that Rundo had been kicked out of Serbia, that police had escorted him to the border with Bosnia and kicked him out of the country. So that is where the odyssey that is Robert Rundo in Eastern Europe is at right now, is he's reportedly being kicked out of the country that he's trying to make a base from, and we'll figure out where the guy goes from there. Now, he's an interesting character because on the one hand, he's really not some kind of hugely important figure or big shot on the far right. He's very clearly somebody who is not very intelligent, doesn't have the organizational skills or the project management skills or anything like that other people on the far right do. He has some charisma and abilities to get people to do things. But I think it's pretty clear if you look at the people he's tried and maybe failed to form relationships with, he's not some super threatening, high-ranking luminary of the far right. But on the other hand, he is still a figure of some importance, of some influence. And what a figure like that does to try to build international networks is of huge importance, particularly if you think about the kinds of people that are going to follow in this guy's wake. Basically, the Rondo story it's fascinating. It's interesting. It reveals a few things about how far right actors operate, but at the same time, he sometimes you can't overstate his importance, because sometimes he's a bit of a clownish figure in terms of how he communicates compared to other people on the far right who are sometimes considerably smarter than he is.
Well, I think we might leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us, Michael.
Fight a war with drones, you can fight a war with loans, you can fight a war with gas or cans of paint. But don't you realize that the game's compromised if you think that this is something that it ain't? 'Cause we got images of murder that don't manage to disturb an international order that is bordering absurd. And no one gets the freedom they were told that they deserve till they realize that freedom's not a noun. It's a verb, it's a verb, freedom is a verb, something never finished, never done. It's something you must make, it's something you must take, it's something you must constantly become. Well, this weekend revolution, it's a radical inclusion. It's a holiday of popular revolt. It's the social interaction of inconsequential actions using faces to replace a silent vote. But lower pay and higher rents, another kind of violence, the violence of silence and of greed. It's the violence of feeling your irrelevance, revealing every way in which you never will be freed. It's a verb, an action and an urge, as fertile as the barrel of a gun. And it happens out of need, it's a fire and a seed, and its terrible potential has begun. Your liberty is constantly in jeopardy. It's something you must loyally defend. But isn't it demeaning when your well-intended meanings mean your means will have to justify your ends? So improvise a barricade of furniture cascading as a carnival of helmets in the flood. For the bottles can be filled with either gasoline or lager or detergent that'll wash away your blood. It's a verb, freedom is a verb, something never finished, never done. It's something you can fake, and it's something that'll break if it ain't something that you constantly become. It's a verb, an action and an urge, as fertile as the barrel of a gun. And it happens out of need, it's a fire and a seed, and its terrible potential has begun.
I really am not understanding why people aren't seeing the fact that prisons are an integral part of a public health response to a pandemic. Like you, I'm really concerned about whether the data is being released very honestly about illnesses within prison. I have suspicions it's not, but really we need very strong leadership in this country that actually cares about people inside our most vulnerable populations inside. That's what we need, and that's not what we're getting right now.
We need to keep radical voices on air. Subscribe now.
Go to 3cr.org.au/subscribe or call the station on 9419 8377.